if Rocky is on, he could maybe even make a clip of it.
Rocky is there.
So the question was asked, something along the line of, WTF is imbuing? That's loosely translated. Or maybe it was, what gives with this imbuing stuff? I'm being generous. I'm sure the question was much more specific and nailed down and something that I wouldn't be able to answer. So I just translated the question to something that I could answer. So the way we'll do that is, let's look at an array of methods for imbuing. Because there's more than one way to imbue. Typically when you're imbuing an object, like an amulet, a wand, a hat. That would be fun. People don't wear hats much anymore, but back when people wore hats, that was a very convenient way to cater about with a magical object on your head. But it can also include things which, well, I'll say what it is. Food, drink. Now, food and drink is technically, I suppose it's an object, but we don't think of it as an object. We think of a pool ball or a brick. That's the kind of objects we think of as objects. Food we think of as a different category. So we can just refer to a thing. And that thing could be a wide variety of different things. And there's definitely more than one way to imbue. Now, is there really more than one way to imbue? I don't know. It could be that there's actually only one method of imbuing. However, if I rephrase my statement, it'll become, for me, a little more clear. I don't know about you. There's more than one way to go about the process of imbuing. So, I mean, if you go about it this way or go about it that way, maybe those end up being the same. But as a practitioner, you have to go about it. And going about it involves procedures. And the ways of going about it are different in their approach. And whether they are in fact very different, or they end up at some level being the same, that's above our pay grade. So let's just look about how it's possible to go about it. Up in Hanford, Washington, you go to their tour, you can buy these little marbles. They're a little green, kind of glowy. They don't glow in the dark. Disappointing. I was hoping they did. But they're kind of these green marbles. They look spooky, weird, cool. The way they manufacture those is they take clear marbles, they stick them right into the reactor, and they let them kind of get subjected to radiation for a while, mostly gamma rays and other such stuff. Because alpha gets, it doesn't go any distance past the surface. Beta rays will go in a little bit, but not that far. It's the gamma that can penetrate right through the marble. So they simmer in radiation for a while, and then they pull them out, and now you have these green, spooky, cool, weird little marbles. That's a kind of imbuing. Only a practitioner, instead of taking the item over to your local nuclear reactor and, fission reactor, and sticking it in there and letting it get irradiated, they take it to a higher space. Let it get exposed to radiations, and then when they come back with it, it has been imbued. That's one form of imbuing. Now, if you're familiar with Diablo, there's a thing you do in Act 1. You can start doing this right in Act 1 normal. Charcy lost her malice, her crafting hammer. I think that's very irresponsible of her, but she lost it, and it was in the barracks, in the possession of a rather cantankerous, large individual who was not about to give it up. As a dungeon party, you go in, and you don't have to dispatch him. You could run in and sneak the malice and run out with it, or you can go in and kill everything in sight and then take the malice and run away. Why you run away after killing everything in sight, I don't know, but it just seems to be par for the course. Bring that back to town, give it to Charcy. She says, "Wow, thanks a bunch. Hey, guess what? I'll imbue an item for you." So what happens in the game is that you then take a normal white item, doesn't have any attributes, no special attributes. You put that, you talk to her and you say, "Yeah, I want to imbue something." She opens up a window. You put your item into a box, and then click the "Go for it" button, and she transforms it, imbues it, and it comes out quite special. That's a form of imbuing. But there's nothing stated about how it's done. That's just sort of the going from ordinary to special example. There's no backstory on how she imbues it. You can just fill in the blanks yourself. If you take a nail, standard 16-penny nail, and you stroke it with a magnet, you run a magnet along the nail, that will orient the iron in the nail. Now, iron has a magnetic moment. Normally, during production, those magnetic arrows, you can call them arrows, they all have little magnetic arrows, a little teeny north and a little teeny south. Every little atoms of iron's got a little teeny weeny north and a teeny weeny south, like a bar magnet, not like a horseshoe. It's like a bar magnet. And the thing is, they point every which way. And there's some theorems, statements of what is, what we find to be true so far. That's what a theorem is. That which we have found to be true so far. This theorem is that inside a sphere, for convenience, if you wanted to calculate the sum total of the magnetic moment, the north-south, the magnetic bar, just add up the vectors for everything inside the circle, and that will end up being the result. So if you take two magnets, one north-south and the other south-north, put them together, effectively it will come to nothing. Fact is, you got to get away from it a certain distance before it comes to nothing, but it does. So if all of these little teeny tiny atomic bar magnets are just randomly oriented, that means for every magnet pointing this way, there's one pointing opposite, and one pointing that way, there's an opposite. There's an opposite for everything. So it ends up having a magnetic dipole of none. But when you stroke it with a magnet, you're starting to orient those little atomic bar magnets. You get them oriented. So now that nail has become magnetized. Well, it's always had a whole bunch of little iron, atomic-sized bar magnets, but they were just oriented all sorts of weird directions. Now they're oriented slightly more of them one way than another. So it'll pick up pins and other things. It's become like a magnet. You can stroke a pin on a magnet and then drop it on the surface of water, clean water with no soap in it, so that the surface tension of the water holds it up, and now you have a compass, because it will orient. Well, that's a form of imbuing. That's one way that imbuing can occur, is to change the structural orientation of the matter in the object, or the non-matter as far as that goes. It is what it is, but you've messed around with the orientations. There's another method you can use for imbuing. Imagine having a hourglass. You have an hourglass, and then, well, actually, no, let's not go there yet. And we're not giving these in order of likelihood or of utility or of preference. If you have a butane lighter, people have had butane lighters. You buy those little cartridges of butane. Empty butane lighter is a model of ordinary. You take that and you bring that ordinary lighter into contact with this thing that is overflowing with specialness, in this case the specialness being butane. It gets squirt into the lighter. Then when you pull it away, it comes away still carrying butane that was brought over because of the pressure. It was basically injected. But there's other ways it can happen. Let's say you take a sphere of some sort and you put it up against the surface of a chamber filled with various gases. One of the gases is magnetic. And you allow for there to be a hole that will communicate between this sphere that you want to imbue and this chamber. And then you bring the magnet over to the sphere. Well, the magnet's going to attract the magnetic gas, not the non-magnetic gas, but the magnetic gas, and bring it over into this ball that you're holding. Then when you pull it away and break connection, that is held in here. Now, it wouldn't be gas. It would be higher substances that we're working with. And it wouldn't be that they're magnetic so much as they are responsive to the attraction of the practitioner. But they are basically drawing substance out of a pool into this object. So that's another potential mechanism for imbuing. This one is just sort of is a way of looking at something, and what's really going on, who knows? But I'll just give you the way that a practitioner can look at it. You take the object, you ascend with that object up the ladder, up Jacob's ladder into higher and higher chambers. That object can only go to chambers in which there is a corresponding. Right? So you go up, 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 and up with the object. As you go up, each stage you go up, to go up the next stage, like we'll start with it at level 1. We'll call this, for the sake of argument, level 1. To go to level 2, the wand, if we're talking about a wand, can have a little bit of not so welcome. To get into level 2, it's cool, the wand can make it. It's there, it can ascend as you bring it up. But there's a little aspect to it that's not really that welcome. Well, if the practitioner can refine the object, that aspect is more or less removed. And then you go to level 3. So each stage along the way, the object is refined. Sanding is a good way to play with this. To go from level 1 to level 2, you can use like a 120 grit to get the real rough edges off the object. And then to get from 2 to 3, you go to a 220 grit sandpaper and you sand it down. And then you take it up to level 4 with 320, and then a 400 and a 600, and maybe a 1200 grit. You take it all the way up. Wood, you'd never do that. You'd never go 1200 on wood. It's just silly. Stone, you might. And as you're sanding, you think that you're just sanding, but you're also doing whatever is required to usher this object into the higher chambers. Then when you come back down, the object has been imbued in the sense that it has been modified in order to access the higher chambers. You see this with a lot of hero quest type fiction, or like the Odyssey. That's not a fable. What do they call that?
Well, it's an epic.
Epic what? Or they just call it an epic?
Saga?
Yeah. Never thought of that.
Tale?
Yeah.
Epic tale?
I would say saga, isn't it?
Not sure. So we'll just say story. So there's a lot of stories in which the hero goes from incident to incident, and in order to make it through an incident, something has to be left behind. Often the thing that's being left behind is lack of confidence, selfishness, hesitancy. Let's find out if we're not broadcasting.
You really see that in the story of Anana when she descends, and there's, she starts out as the queen of heaven, and at each step, things are stripped away from her.
Well, with the modern stories, I'm thinking of one where this kid's a wannabe kung fu guy, and he ends up in another realm, and he's got this staff that he's supposed to return to the Monkey King, so the Monkey King can save the day. Well, as he goes through the adventure, he's refining himself. He's taking on confidence. He's taking on competence. He's taking on some certain life lessons. Things like, don't be a schmuck and run off without telling your friends where you're going, and little things like that. Well, he's being rarefied. So when he comes back, he's different. He's actually been imbued. So you can do the same with an object that you're working on. You're just making it so that it's in correspondence from step to step to step to step to step. So that's basically ushering it through the process. If you have an object which is sort of already made, you can ascend with that as far as it goes, and then when you get there, it's like you're starting out with a mundane object, but when you get there, to be in that higher chamber, it can't be a mundane object. It's a higher object. So when you bring it down, you don't turn the dial from exalted to mundane. You bring it back in its exalted form. So you've taken it up, you've grabbed the exalted form, and you're bringing that back down. It's been imbued.
Almost sounds like the host. During Mass where it's offered up and then it's transformed and then brought down.
It's possible, but there's another one that we're going to talk about that I'll skip this one because your example, I think, might touch on the next one. And this is another method for imbuing, which is you take the object, you run a process on it which establishes a quantum coupling with like the exalted prime of that object. I'm using a little bit of Platonic thought form in there, but the idea is that there's a version of that thing which is the exalted form, and by coupling the one you have that you're imbuing, deliberately imbuing, by quantum coupling it, to the exalted form, this one now takes on the qualities of the exalted version. So that's another available mechanism. Another form of imbuing, which maybe isn't truly imbuing, is to cleanse the object. Here the idea being that it is in its fundamental nature imbued, but through contact with the mundane has lost its quality of being functionally imbued. So by cleansing it, this could be something as simple as taking a crystal, burying it in Epsom salts and letting it sit for a certain amount of time, or fumigating it with incense, or putting it into those nice domes, which are perfect for this. Of course, the dome, there's a lot going on with that. Yes, smoke or incense in the dome is sort of the same as the kind of practice you'd use to cleanse. But there's so much more that can be going on in those domes because of their proximity to the super beacon and because of their own nature. They can also be activating many of these other mechanisms that we talked about. And I actually believe that when a practitioner is actually doing it, it can easily end up being a mixture of many of these mechanisms. I'll go over the last one I have on this list. The list is not comprehensive, by the way. It just happens to be what I've thought of mulling over the question since Tamara asked in the car on the way over. And that has to do with shape. If you can bring the shape of a thing into alignment with the shape of the exalted version, then that's another form of imbuing. But it's not that you're borrowing. It's like if you're working on a violin face, the top of a violin, as you work the shape of that wood, you allow it to resonate in a particular way. If it's too fat or bulbous or tall or thin or anything off what is desirable for that, it won't vibrate properly. When somebody's making a call those things? The little oil drum that's cut off and pounded out to make the different notes.
Oh, the happy or the
like that, and all of these end up being not that separable, right? But it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that can contribute. And once you have that, it gives you some idea of what you should avoid when handling an imbued object. Smacking an imbued object with a mallet is a bad idea because it can scramble the field that's been established. Contaminating it with elements or aspects which don't correspond to the higher can draw it down away from its exalted form. Mucking about with its shape. Could break it. I mean, if you don't know what I'm talking about, get an alarm clock and take it apart and see what happens when you try to put it back together. It can be educational. But if you want to do that, maybe you should get a trainer clock, clocks that are made to be taken apart and put back together. Yes, there are clocks like that. And work with one of those. Or in terms of like the hobo nickels, whether it be a mercury dime, whatever, you get some tools and you give it a try. I wouldn't buy one of those from here that EJ's been working on and then go in and decide to sand it here and there. I'm not sure that would be a good idea. A healthy dash of ketchup and mustard and Worcestershire sauce on your meal that has been imbued into higher substance by a knowledgeable cook. Probably a bad idea. You can look at these various mechanisms and you go, oh, okay, that makes sense. Now, when I read what they say to do with it, it all makes sense. Like, why wrap your tarot cards in silk? Well, to keep it vibrationally separated from the mundane world. Because you've got lightning in a bottle. What's the best way to get lightning out of a bottle so that it's just a bottle? Drain it off. Right? So this might give you some sense so that some of the procedures that you've heard about how to handle sacred objects won't be such weirdo ritual with no rhyme or reason, because there is rhyme and reason. You're trying to maintain these objects in their higher form, their imbued state. And in some cases, you're trying to keep them charged, hence the super beacon, etc. Is that a question up there, that big thing, or is somebody just saying hello very verbosely?
There's a few questions or comments. Bernie LaPlante says, contagion, saturation, infusion, learning by contact. Rocky says, wearing essential oils and temp tats also imbues the machine. Breeza asks, in terms of magic, what is the difference between amulets and medallions?